Humans can be so foolish sometimes, don't you think? My name is Erica, and I've been married to my husband for 3 years. We live together with our adorable kitten, Bella. My mother-in-law places immense value on academic achievements and takes great pride in the fact that her son, Kevin, graduated from a prestigious university. In our small town, where there's only one convenience store, she's quite a well-known figure and has a strong connection with the neighbors. At neighborhood gatherings, she mostly boasts about her son's accomplishments. She believes that a woman who marries such a man should also have an impressive educational background. When we first met, during the announcement of our engagement, she immediately asked, "Which university did you graduate from?" "I'm a Harvard alumna, you know." When I told her the name of my university, she made a noticeably disapproving face. It seemed she hadn't heard of it. To her, an unfamiliar university meant it was a lower-tier school, and she assumed I was poorly educated. Since then, she seemed to have a problem with my educational background. While she allowed the marriage, she began to treat me poorly afterward. She would wait until my husband and father-in-law weren't around and then say things like, "Why did Kevin have to marry someone with such a low level of education?" She'd imply, "Someone like you isn't a good match for him." She even suggested, "You must have forced him into this marriage or manipulated him somehow." And the worst was, "It's a shame for any child to have a mother like you. It's better not to have children at all." These were the kinds of things she would say every time we met. Fortunately, we weren't living together at the time, but she would still come over whenever she had free time just to criticize my education and then leave. My mother-in-law seemed pleased with herself, but it stressed me out so much that I started getting gray hairs. She even gossiped about me to the neighbors, saying things like, "Erica can't even do basic math," or "She can only recite the alphabet up to H." As a result, I often found myself being laughed at by the locals. I considered talking back many times, but I knew she would likely fabricate a story about me getting violent and spread it around the neighborhood. So, I endured it all without telling anyone. One day, my in-laws decided to rebuild their house. My father-in-law had hurt his back, and they wanted to make the house more accessible. We were grateful for everything my father-in-law had done for us, so we offered to help pay for the renovations. My mother-in-law planned a big celebration with the neighbors for the housewarming, and of course, I ended up being the one to prepare everything. "I'll help you," my husband offered, but my mother-in-law quickly intervened, saying, "Come here, Kevin. I want to show off my highly educated son," and dragged him away. As she left, she remarked, "Someone with your low education should at least be good at cooking, so get on with the preparations." During the party, my mother-in-law was in high spirits. As expected, she began her usual bragging to everyone, saying, "My son built this house. What a wonderful and beautiful son he is. I wonder who raised such a child." "Oh, that's me." The older ladies in the neighborhood sounded envious, which only encouraged her. She continued, "And then there's his wife. She didn't contribute a penny but acts like she owns the place. She doesn't even want to give me grandchildren. The wicked woman." She then turned her usual disdainful gaze toward me and continued to insult me. Annoyed, I replied bluntly, "What's up?" "There she goes. That's the problem with uneducated wives," she shot back. "She hasn't had any kids yet, she's greedy for money, and she's probably eyeing our inheritance." She even accused me, "I bet she put something in today's meal. None of you should eat it," belittling the food I had prepared. Ironically, she was eating my cooking herself. Not that it mattered. Even if there were something in it, she'd probably survive just fine. She's resilient, to say the least. She whispered with a sneer, "Well, can't expect much from Erica's kids. They'll have those low education genes mixed in," making sure my husband and father-in-law couldn't hear her. She always harassed me without letting others catch on, which infuriated me. The ladies around us chimed in with laughter, agreeing with her. That's right. When I glared at them, they awkwardly looked away. I couldn't understand why they agreed with her if they felt bad about it. She wasn't some powerful figure, or maybe she had some hold over them. Even as these thoughts crossed my mind, the stream of insults from my mother-in-law continued unabated. I wondered how long this life would go on. Did I have to endure her bullying forever? For what purpose? Lost in these thoughts, I soon made a decision. "I can't stand it anymore," I suddenly shouted, startling both my mother-in-law and the kitten Bella. "Sorry for scaring you, Bella. I'll give you some treats later," I said to the kitten. Then I turned to my mother-in-law and said, "You hate me, right? You don't want a child born from someone with low education like me, do you?" And who knows what would happen to them after they're born? Maybe they'd be abandoned in the mountains. Oh, scary, scary. What? I would never do such a thing, she exclaimed. And by the way, I expect you to repay every penny I contributed to building this house, I stated calmly. My mother-in-law was visibly shaken by my unexpected words. What nonsense are you talking about all of a sudden? She retorted, her voice echoing through the house. This commotion caught the attention of my husband and father-in-law, who quickly came over to see what was happening. The surrounding guests also looked on curiously, so I decided to seize the opportunity to fully confront my mother-in-law and expose her wrongdoings. What's all the yelling about? My husband asked, clearly alarmed. Listen to this. Erica, who claims she didn't contribute any money, is now demanding I pay her back for the house. My mother-in-law exclaimed, attempting to paint me as unreasonable. All eyes suddenly turned to me. But you said you didn't want a child from me, right? Mother-in-law, isn't that what you've been saying, ladies? I asked the nearby women. Yes, that's true. She always says that, they admitted reluctantly. She said she doesn't want those low education genes, they added. My mother-in-law stood there, stunned by their betrayal, her mouth agape. She probably never imagined they would turn on her. Serves her right. Why should I silently endure bullying from you? I'm not your punching bag for stress relief. I turned back to my mother-in-law, my voice seething with anger. My husband and father-in-law gasped in shock at the revelation. Have you been bullying Erica? Don't mess with me, my father-in-law demanded, his face flushing red with rage as he confronted her. Despite being unnerved by his rare outburst, my mother-in-law attempted to defend herself. But it's true, a child from low-educated Erica won't turn out well. Besides, she's just a housewife living off my son. I haven't said anything wrong, she shouted defiantly. However, as she noticed the cold, disapproving stares from both my husband and father-in-law, her face went pale. In front of them, she always portrayed herself as the perfect mother-in-law. Now, her thick-skinned demeanor, which was more resilient than her makeup, had been thoroughly stripped away. My husband sighed and turned to my mother-in-law with a cold expression. Mom, what are you talking about? Erica graduated from Harvard. She's far more educated than I am. The room fell into stunned silence. What do you mean? The university Erica mentioned before we got married was some obscure third-rate place, my mother-in-law exclaimed in panic. But the truth was, I did graduate from Harvard. The university she mistook for a third-rate institution was actually Cambridge University, an esteemed name recognized worldwide. After earning my degree, I continued my studies in the UK and completed my master's degree there, which is my highest qualification. When my mother-in-law inquired about my alma mater, I simply mentioned Cambridge without thinking much of it. I never anticipated that this misunderstanding would lead to such mistreatment. Given her Harvard background and high regard for education, she should have known that Cambridge is among the top 5 universities globally. Although the misunderstanding had escalated things, I had no intention of correcting it. I had lost any desire for a long-term relationship with such a mother-in-law. After all, a person's worth isn't defined by their educational background. My parents didn't attend college, but I hold them in the highest regard. I hadn't intended to discuss my education, but this was a perfect opportunity to address it. My actions had clearly upset my husband on my behalf. He said, "Listen, this house was funded in part by $100,000 from Erica's savings. Savings you, Mom, look down upon. How could you insult her like that? And by the way, your college isn't Harvard. It's just a school near Harvard. That doesn't make you a Harvard graduate, Mother. Now's not the time for that discussion. We're talking about the money. There's no way a housewife like Erica could have accumulated that kind of money. Erica isn't just a housewife. In fact, she earns several times more than I do." "What did you say?" My mother-in-law's surprise was evident. "Yes, I make my living through stock trading, earning over $10,000 a month." I never mentioned this to my mother-in-law, so it's understandable that she might have assumed otherwise. Given her love for money almost as much as her reverence for education, if she knew, she'd likely demand luxury cars and the latest gadgets. That's why I asked my husband to keep it a secret. Since I'm usually at home when she calls or visits unexpectedly, she assumed I was just a housewife. My mother-in-law stood there, speechless and stunned by this revelation. To answer a question some of you might have, why did I contribute to the house's funds for someone I didn't like? Normally, one wouldn't want to give a single cent. The reason is straightforward. It was to avoid any arguments about living arrangements. By funding a comfortable and accessible home for her, I hoped she would be content and not bother us, especially after her minor injury. If she was comfortable in her own house, she'd likely visit ours less often. It was an expense I justified for my own peace of mind. Doesn't that make sense? Now, having fully recognized my mother-in-law as an adversary, I said firmly, I want the full $100,000 back. If you can't repay it, sell the land and house. If that's not feasible, borrow the money from a financial institution. That's outrageous. This house is ours now, and I have no intention of giving you a penny, my mother-in-law declared defiantly. Breaking his silence, my father-in-law shouted, How much longer do you plan to upset everyone around you? Look at the room. Nobody is on your side. My mother-in-law began to cry as my father-in-law berated her, but despite his pleas for her to apologize, she refused to humble herself, her pride too great. In the end, she left without offering an apology or even glancing my way. I'm so sorry, Erica. If I had been more attentive, this wouldn't have happened, my father-in-law said, deeply apologetic. There was no need for him to apologize. My mother-in-law only bullied me when he was unaware. Please lift your head. You've done nothing wrong. Please continue to treat me as your real daughter, I said, placing my hand on his shoulder. My father-in-law responded, Thank you, Erica. Leave her to me. I'll ensure she never bothers you again. And he went after my mother-in-law. The mood around us seemed to lighten as the situation settled. The neighborhood ladies, visibly relieved, apologized to me and promised to sever ties with my mother-in-law, which greatly lifted my spirits. A month later, my father-in-law announced that he was divorcing my mother-in-law. It turned out the issues went beyond that day's confrontation. My mother-in-law had been involved in an affair with a highly educated, middle-aged man. My father-in-law, suspecting something was wrong, had hired a private investigator to gather evidence discreetly. The divorce was swiftly finalized, and my mother-in-law was ordered to repay the $100,000 I had contributed for the house renovations as part of the alimony. Apparently, her lover financed this amount, and in return she was now working as a maid, my father-in-law reported with a look of disbelief. Now, both my father-in-law and I can live free from the troubles caused by my mother-in-law. I'm now 5 months pregnant, and my husband, father-in-law, and the neighborhood ladies are all deeply concerned about my health and have been incredibly supportive. In a way, I have to thank my mother-in-law for helping me gain such a supportive circle. Looking ahead, I'm excited about the future and look forward to a happy life with my soon-to-be-born child, my husband, father-in-law, and our cat, Bella. The hot spring trip was suggested by my husband, and it was supposed to be a delightful getaway just for the two of us. However, without telling me, he invited our son and his wife, with whom I have a strained relationship. When we arrived at the hotel, my son's wife bluntly said, If you dislike being with Mike and me so much, why don't you sleep in the parking lot or somewhere around there? Her mocking words, combined with my husband and son's failure to intervene, pushed me to my breaking point. Fine, do as you please. I'll be sleeping outside then. Bye, I retorted and got into the rental car parked in the hotel lot, heading out for a night stroll to clear my mind. As I wandered the streets until dawn, I heard the sirens of ambulances and fire engines. When I turned my phone back on, I found an incredible number of missed calls from my husband and son. What the hell are you doing? How many times do you think we called and texted you? My husband demanded when I answered. He and my son were frantic, explaining that a careless smoking incident had caused a fire scare at the hotel. I was utterly appalled by their lack of apology, so I gave my husband one last chance. Hey, which is more important to you? Mike and his wife or me? What? What's with that all of a sudden? Is this the time to be asking that? Just come back already, he replied. I see, that's fine. Well, Mike is your child with that woman anyway, and it seems like I'm no longer in your eyes. Hearing these words, my husband and son were perplexed on the other end of the phone. That's when I decided to spill a secret, a hidden truth we had been carrying within our marriage. My name is Elizabeth, 46 years old, and this year marks the 20th anniversary of my marriage to James. We both work for a hobby manufacturer company, with James in sales and me in accounting, just as we have since our marriage. We were blessed with a son, Mike, who has become a delightful part of our lives by marrying Jennifer, a girl he met at university. To outsiders, we might appear to be a normal, happy family, but in reality, we are facing a certain issue. One day, as I was preparing dinner after returning home, I noticed James researching something on the computer. Curious, I peered over and saw beautiful resorts and hot springs displayed on the screen. I couldn't help but lean in closer with excitement. James turned to me and said, "Actually, I've been thinking about planning a trip soon." "A trip? That sounds wonderful." I couldn't contain my excitement and raised my voice. "See, we've both been busy working and haven't had much chance for this kind of thing. Don't you think it's about time we let loose a bit?" "Yes, I've been feeling the same way," he replied. Fortunately, outside of our busy seasons, we both have flexible schedules that allow for time off. Just thinking about the trip made me giddy with excitement, something that hadn't happened in years. Though James initially helped with household chores after our marriage, he eventually stopped, citing work as the reason, leaving me to handle most of it. This trip, suggested by James himself, was a much-needed break from the accumulated fatigue and stress, more than anything. I was happy when my husband, who usually only showed interest in his work and rarely conversed with me, suggested we go on a trip together. "The trip is a great idea," I said, "but there's something I've been hesitant to talk to you about." "Hesitant about what? What is it?" he asked. "You know what I'm talking about. It's about Mike and Jennifer." Hearing our son and daughter-in-law's names made my expression darken. Since advancing to junior high, Mike had grown distant and cold towards me, his mother. Ignoring my attempts to talk, he would lock himself in his room or go out, and on the rare occasions he did respond, it was with a dismissive, "It's nothing," or "Leave me alone." At times he was outright rude, demanding, "Hurry up with the food," or "Give me some pocket money." There were even instances when I was locked out of the house, not just by the door but by a chain gate. Initially, I dismissed it as a phase of rebellion, but when his harsh words and actions persisted, I grew concerned and consulted James several times. However, James brushed it off, saying, "Isn't that just a phase of rebellion? Or maybe just adolescence? You should understand that and deal with him properly as a mother," showing little concern for the matter. I tried to reach out to Mike, but his attitude remained unchanged. After advancing to high school, he moved into a dorm and continued living in one during university, hardly ever returning home. Even after marrying Jennifer, I wasn't invited to their wedding, and my letters of congratulations went unanswered. When Mike brought his wife Jennifer home, I immediately sensed a mismatch. Her brightly dyed hair, heavy makeup, and flamboyant attire made her appear quite flashy, even for her age. In front of James and Mike, Jennifer behaved normally. But the moment we were alone, she stared at me, then glared and said, "I wondered what kind of woman the mother of Mike would be, only to find out she's this plain. No wonder Mike detests you." Her derogatory words and expression cut deep. I thought Jennifer was indeed a perfect match for Mike. Interestingly, they didn't have any children and seemed to live a carefree life, despite their apparent dislike for me. Much like Mike's. From the day they were introduced, they began to frequent our house often, usually with Mike in tow. When they visited, Mike and Jennifer would lounge around, hurling insults at me, and even stay for dinner. I was left to prepare and clean up the meals alone while they arrogantly demanded more drinks and snacks, leaving me no peace. I rarely joined their conversations, but Jennifer once condescendingly said, "Elizabeth, why do you even work after getting married? Spending hours surrounded by old men making toys?" I couldn't do that. Jennifer, being supported by Mike, doesn't work herself, and given her habit of skipping work, likely wouldn't last long in any job. Hearing her gleefully talk about skipping past jobs, I sighed inwardly. Unable to tolerate Mike and Jennifer's selfish and tyrannical behavior any longer, I once again sought advice from James. However, he simply said, "Mike is still as rebellious as ever, but Jennifer isn't that bad, right?" Feeling miserable, I replied, "But I'm being treated like a maid by Jennifer." I had my job too, and my body couldn't handle the stress any longer. Despite my concerns, James would just play dumb and brush it off, claiming he didn't know what to do. Eventually, the visits from Mike and Jennifer stopped. Whether they no longer wanted to see me or had other obligations such as work or finances, the reason was unclear, but their absence from our home was certain. Still, it seemed James continued to meet with them. Sometimes I could smell their perfume and cigarette smoke on him when he came home. As an asthmatic, cigarette smoke was particularly harmful to me, so I had asked Mike and Jennifer to refrain from smoking inside the house during their visits. Even with our strained relationship, I found relief in not having to endure their unpleasant behavior. I was determined to ensure they wouldn't interfere with our hot spring trip, and I worked hard to convince James of this. Relieved when he agreed, I looked forward to our trip to Hawaii. I pored over the guidebook daily, bought new clothes, and eagerly anticipated the vacation. However, the intrusion began on the very first day. As we arrived at the airport security check for our Hawaii-bound flight, pulling our suitcases and preparing to pass through the ticket gates, I was stunned to hear familiar voices. I turned around to see Mike and Jennifer standing there. "What? Why are you here?" I asked in disbelief. "Didn't Dad tell you? We decided to come along to Hawaii," Mike replied. I was dumbfounded and glared at James. "Mike and Jennifer have always dreamed of going to Hawaii," he said. "I'll handle them, so please let's go together." I was astounded. Despite all my efforts, including working hard and dieting for this trip, James still prioritized Mike and Jennifer. My plan seemed ruined, and I decided there was no point in going to Hawaii with such unpleasant feelings. As I was about to turn back, Mike and Jennifer stopped me. "For the past 11 years, I've wanted to reconcile with you, Mom, but I couldn't bring myself to be honest about it," Mike said. "I know my behavior wasn't right, and I realize now that I've been awkward and unfair. I want to get along with you, Elizabeth, and I don't want to strain our relationship any further." I was taken aback. It was the first time Mike had shown such humility, and Jennifer seemed eager to avoid appearing as the villain. Reluctantly, I agreed to go to Hawaii with the four of us. On the plane, Mike and Jennifer were in high spirits, ordering and starting to drink alcohol, while James sat happily next to me. Despite their upbeat mood, I felt an odd sense of unease and tried to distract myself by gazing at the scenery outside the window. Upon arriving in Hawaii and renting a car, we started our trip based on the plan James had revised on the plane. However, it wasn't long before Mike and Jennifer began to ignore my presence, speaking only to James. At water-based attractions like Sea Life Park and Waikiki Beach, they would intentionally trip me, making me fall and get soaked. At lunch, they pushed their leftovers onto me, among other forms of harassment. The tension escalated after dinner when Mike and Jennifer came to our hotel room, wanting to drink. When James went downstairs to get some snacks, Mike and Jennifer, who had bought alcohol in Hawaii, sat on my bed without asking. Mike pulled out an ashtray and cigarettes. "Hey, this is a non-smoking room. Stop it, please," I said. "It's fine if we ventilate," Mike replied with an annoyed look, and Jennifer began to light a cigarette as well. Reaching my limit, I shouted, "Enough. Stop smoking in a non-smoking room. You'll get us thrown out if you don't follow the hotel's rules." "What's with you all of a sudden?" Mike retorted. "I told you before that I have asthma and can't handle cigarette smoke. Please follow the hotel's rules," I said, struggling to keep my composure. "Your serious motherly attitude has always been so irritating," Jennifer snapped. "Smoking in a non-smoking room is the height of rudeness. God, you're so annoying. What's wrong with having fun on a trip? If you hate smoke so much, why don't you sleep in the parking lot or somewhere else?" My head went blank from their words. Just then, James returned from his errand. "Hey, it's loud even in the hallway. What's with all the shouting?" "I can't stand being with these two for another second," I said. "They're trying to smoke in a non-smoking room, and why did you bring them along despite me saying no?" "This is unbelievable," I said, my pent-up emotions overflowing with tears. Mike and Jennifer looked down at me, smirking. "You're just annoying, acting all high and mighty," Mike said with a smirk. "You're no fun, not even drinking a single sip of alcohol." I felt something snap inside me. "Fine, I get it. I'd rather sleep outside than stay here. Bye." "Hey, Elizabeth," James began, but I quickly gathered my valuables and phone and stormed out of the room. James tried to stop me by grabbing my arm, but I shook him off. "Leave me alone. I want to be alone," I said, my voice trembling. I hurried out of the hotel and made my way to the parking lot. There was no sign of James following me. I got into the rental car and drove around Hawaii at night, trying to clear my head. Despite my suspicions, Mike and Jennifer hadn't changed their attitude towards me, and James was no better. Despite my desperate pleas, he had brought Mike and Jennifer along without my consent. It seemed impossible to continue any semblance of a family relationship after this trip, especially with the secret about James and Mike that I had kept hidden. The more I thought about it, the more anger and sadness overwhelmed me, so I kept driving to calm myself down. As I drove through Hawaii's beautiful night scenery, my heated mind gradually cooled. After a while, tiredness set in, so I parked the rental car in a coastal park and decided to rest inside. I thought I heard sirens in the distance, but I was too exhausted to care and quickly fell asleep. When I woke up, dawn had broken, and the sparkling sea greeted me with its beauty. Soothing my spirits, I had breakfast at a seaside diner and then remembered to check my phone. I had turned it off before driving because I didn't want to hear from James or see his texts. Now, calm. I turned on my phone and was shocked by the number of missed calls and texts starting from around 11 o'clock last night. There were at least 30 or 40 of them. Just then, a call from James came in. "What the hell are you doing? Do you know how many times we've tried to reach you? I've called and texted you." James's voice was a mix of anger and distress. "What do you mean? I just had breakfast at a seaside diner," I replied, confused. "While we're in deep trouble, you're casually having breakfast." Mike's voice came through, irritated. "What trouble are you talking about?" "It's exactly as it sounds," James said. "After you left, we had a little party with cigarettes, alcohol, and snacks. Before we knew it, we fell asleep, and when we woke up, the room was filled with smoke." "A fire?" I asked, horrified. "Yes," James confirmed. "The cause was Mike and Jennifer's cigarettes not being fully extinguished. Thankfully, it was just a small fire, but the fire trucks arrived in droves, and everyone in the hotel had to evacuate. Now we're being blamed for it." Jennifer suffered a minor burn and was taken to the hospital. Mike and I have to go to the police for questioning and apologize to the hotel staff. "I see now. The sirens I heard last night must have been for that," I said, stunned by the extent of their carelessness. Then James, in his usual carefree and irresponsible manner, said, "So, we're tied up here and can't leave. Can you go to the hospital and stay with Jennifer?" The lack of apology and his prioritization of Jennifer over me made it clear that some things would never change. I decided to give James one last chance. "James, who is more important to you, me or Mike and Jennifer?" "What? Why are you asking that now?" "This isn't the time," James replied, sounding bewildered. "Well," I said. By then, I was completely disillusioned with James's attitude. "Hey, what do you mean? Don't joke around at a time like this," James said, his frustration evident. "Well, Mike is your child with that woman, and it seems I'm no longer in your thoughts," I said, as both James and Mike looked confused by my words. I took a deep breath and decided it was time to reveal the secret I had kept hidden. "Mike, you are the child of your father and his mistress," I said firmly. Mike was stunned into silence and James grew visibly agitated as I continued. 24 years ago, James had an affair with a woman who worked with us at the time. By the time I discovered the affair, she was already pregnant. She had the audacity to tell me, "I'll give you the child, so don't demand any compensation." I found her contemptible, but I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the child. So, I decided to raise the child, yourself, as my own without seeking any compensation. The mistress was fired and James's affair became known, but taking you in helped soften the blow. Despite not being biologically related, I raised you as my own. However, your rebellious phase began in middle school and only worsened over time, which I initially thought was normal adolescent behavior. As the years went by, your attitude grew increasingly challenging. Realizing you were indeed the child of James and his mistress, I was torn between the affection I had developed for you and the harsh reality. Mike, still in shock, shouted through the phone, "That can't be true. I can't just be some bastard child. I have proof of your father's affair," I said. "I keep it with me because I didn't trust James to keep it safe." "So, you're saying you're not my real mother?" "That's what I've been trying to tell you. I tried to be a real mother, but it's clear we don't get along. Maybe it's because you carry that woman's blood." Mike fell silent, grappling with the gravity of the revelation. James's voice rose in frustration. "What are you saying? You promised you wouldn't tell Mike." "I don't care about promises. Be grateful for the 24 years I've put up with this," I retorted before ending the call. I blocked both James and Mike and decided to enjoy the rest of my Hawaii trip on my own, returning to New York before them. Back home, I packed up my belongings, moved back into my parents' house, and prepared divorce papers for James. A colleague later informed me of the aftermath of their hot spring trip. They were severely reprimanded by the police for their negligence, and the hotel demanded a hefty compensation for the disturbance caused by smoking in a non-smoking room. With my parents' help, they managed to navigate the legal and financial fallout. My divorce from James was finalized smoothly and soon became the topic of office gossip. James's work performance declined, leading to his quiet resignation. He struggled to find new employment, eventually borrowing money from various acquaintances and declaring bankruptcy. Mike's financial and mental stability also deteriorated, leading to constant arguments with Jennifer. As for me, I found solace in the hot springs during my solo trip and now visit several times a year with my parents and friends. My work has flourished and I've been promoted to head of the accounting department. At 31, I finally reached a turning point with my misunderstanding husband. We had been married for 3 years, having initially met as colleagues before tying the knot. When we got married, I left my job, which was a common practice in our countryside community. Although the tradition felt restrictive, it was a significant factor in my decision to resign. My previous workplace was a small, somewhat insular company with a notably old-fashioned ethos reflecting its local roots. In that environment, it was nearly unthinkable for a married couple to continue working together, especially given the prevailing attitude that married women should not hold full-time jobs. This societal norm, coupled with the company's outdated views, made it clear that my role there was no longer sustainable. At my new job, I was treated like little more than an intern, while my husband remained in the same department as before. My responsibilities were limited to menial tasks such as making coffee, photocopying, and cleaning. Work that, while not inherently demeaning, was disproportionately assigned to me. It seemed like a deliberate attempt to push me out, as even the actual trainees weren't relegated to such monotonous duties all day. Discussing the issue with my husband proved futile. It was unclear whether he was even listening or simply avoiding the topic, perhaps because he feared that if I became a stay-at-home wife, we'd lose our financial flexibility. One day, my mother called to suggest I reach out to my cousin after hearing about my frustrations at work. She had discussed my situation with various relatives and acquaintances, and as a result, my cousin connected me with a job opportunity. A company where one of his classmates worked was hiring, and they believed my experience would be valuable, so he encouraged me to interview. I was fortunate enough to land the job, and I shared the exciting news with everyone. However, my husband's reaction was oddly muted. Though I found this strange, his lack of objection led me to go ahead and resign. My resignation was promptly accepted. They had clearly been expecting it. My colleagues, who had been gossiping about me, bid me farewell with insincere cheerfulness. "We'll miss you. Let's go out for drinks sometime. Feel free to reach out anytime." I couldn't help but wonder which of them truly meant it. My new job is located in the neighboring city, which, though smaller than a major metropolitan area, boasts an office district with a distinctly urban feel. Upon joining, I discovered that the company's culture was refreshingly modern. There was no bias based on age or gender, and the diverse workforce included several international employees. The company embraced equality, including fair pay, regardless of marital status. My salary has significantly increased compared to my previous job, to the point where I now earn nearly $10,000 more per year than my husband. This is likely due to the absence of gender discrimination. Both men and women receive equal pay for the same work. I haven't shared this with my husband yet, as I suspect he might have difficulty accepting it given his personality and the norms at my former workplace. My dissatisfaction with the workplace vanished, and I found myself genuinely fulfilled in my new role. However, not everything is perfect. My husband contributes nothing to housework, leaving me to handle everything on my own. Balancing full-time work with managing household chores for 2 people is incredibly draining. I leave for work earlier than he does and come home quite late, yet he never takes on any household responsibilities. Instead, he spends his time snacking and lounging on the couch, leaving the house messier each day. When I return, I'm greeted with requests like, "I'm hungry. Hurry up and make dinner," or similar demands for food, a bath, or coffee. Just hearing these requests is exhausting. Although I chose to work, and I suppose this situation is partly my responsibility, I now realize I might have been influenced by outdated notions and expectations at the time. Since we got married, my husband has repeatedly insisted on his own correctness while highlighting my shortcomings. He would say things like, "Work is tough because you lack the ability," If you want to manage both work and home, you need to try harder. If housework isn't going well, it's because you're inefficient. Get used to it and improve quickly. And since he chose to work, don't slack off on housework. These criticisms were a constant refrain. In rural areas, it's more common for men not to participate in housework compared to urban settings. Most of the married women I knew handled all household chores themselves, with some even managing childcare, caregiving, and farming. This environment led my husband to make me feel that it was natural for me to take on all the domestic responsibilities. Both my mother and mother-in-law were stay-at-home moms, and many women of my generation were either housewives or worked part-time. Despite being a full-time employee, I may have grown numb to the situation, simply accepting my husband's expectations and continuing with the housework as he dictated. Although my husband never explicitly told me to quit my job, I was determined to keep working even if he had. I convinced myself that since I was committed to my career, I couldn't neglect the housework. This routine persisted for a while. Even after I switched jobs, my husband remained in a bad mood when I came home after working late. I would apologize, prepare his dinner, and then rush through the housework, often barely having time to eat my own meal. One day, however, something changed. My husband found my wage statement, which I had carelessly left in a drawer. He stared at it in silence, and despite my attempts to downplay it by saying things like, "It's just because of overtime this time," or "maybe you'll earn more than me soon," my words had no effect. After that incident, my husband ignored me for days. He refused to speak or even look at me when I tried to communicate. Even if I stumbled or made a noise, he would completely ignore it. Eventually, I stopped attempting to engage with him, and just as I adjusted to this silent routine, he abruptly broke his silence. One evening, as I entered the living room after coming home, he shouted, "I'm home. What time do you think it is?" At my current job, there's a core time everyone is expected to be present, but the exact hours for arriving and leaving aren't strictly enforced, leading to varying departure times. Despite my efforts to start early and explaining my situation to my boss, I sometimes got home after 9 p.m. I would prepare ready-made or frozen meals that only needed reheating, yet my husband insisted on waiting for me to serve him. "You shouldn't slack off on housework. The only reason you can keep working is because I allow it," he would yell at me while I hurriedly prepared dinner. His intimidation was palpable throughout the entire exchange. "You're just going to skip cleaning and laundry and go to bed, making excuses that it's too late. You're coming home late on purpose to slack off." Even when I got home late, I diligently took care of the quieter housework tasks. Despite my efforts, the results were far from perfect, and I often felt I deserved the scolding I received. I blamed myself, accepting the criticism as warranted. "Monica, are you listening? Don't get too full of yourself just because you're working," he would say. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work. I'll try not to take it for granted." I genuinely believed this at the time. Perhaps I was led to believe it. To manage my workload, I took on extra weekend shifts to cut down on weekday overtime. I vacuumed and did laundry daily, trying my hardest to keep up with the household chores. A few months later, I had an epiphany. Why am I struggling so much on my own? The realization came after seeing a colleague's lunchbox. Her husband was responsible for cooking at their house and even prepared her lunch. I was taken aback, but my other colleagues seemed unfazed. They expressed envy but also remarked how normal it was to share household responsibilities when both partners worked. I couldn't bring myself to share my situation, as none of them appeared to be handling all the housework alone. When I casually asked relatives and friends about their household arrangements, I was astonished to find that none of their husbands did as little as mine. This realization led me to stop handling his share of the housework. I no longer cleaned his room or did his laundry, and I only prepared and heated food for myself. His yelling didn't bother me. I felt a healthy adult should be able to take care of themselves. I left for work much earlier than he did and returned home quite late. Why should I be burdened with household chores long after he had gone to bed? It wasn't fair for me to do all the housework. Even if he ranted about housework being a woman's job or a wife's duty, I ignored him and focused on eating. "So now you think you're something special just because you're earning a bit more money?" he exclaimed before storming out of the house. As I watched him leave, my heart felt cold. His focus on money and the insults he hurled at me made me realize that all my care and effort had been in vain. I couldn't endure it any longer. The next day, he stopped coming home. I assumed he would reach out if there was an issue, so I left the situation alone, only to find out he had moved back in with his parents. Whenever he returned to collect his things, we would have brief and tense discussions. Each time, he resorted to abuse and even shoved me a few times. It was supposed to be a final chance for us, but it felt futile. I was willing to consider rebuilding our relationship if he showed any willingness to compromise, but his actions made it clear that was impossible. Having made my decision, I began the process of filing for divorce. First, I casually brought it up with my mother during one of our regular conversations. She was very supportive, telling me that I had been patient enough and that the decision was long overdue. Next, I reached out to my mother-in-law on a weekend when my husband wasn't around. Although we didn't see each other often, she had always been kind and caring. She was initially surprised by my decision to consider divorce but assured me she would support me. After these discussions, I visited a lawyer to start the formal process. I presented evidence of my husband's behavior, including a timeline of events, my personal diary, photos of bruises from when he had shoved me, and recordings of his verbal abuse. The lawyer noted that while it was a borderline case for domestic violence liability, the evidence was substantial and worth pursuing. I decided to forgo dividing our assets in exchange for not asking for alimony. I rented a room near my workplace and began packing my things. On moving day, I confronted my husband to settle our affairs. He had been buying meals from the supermarket and coming home daily as he didn't want to inconvenience his parents. When I told him we needed to talk, he gave me the usual silent treatment. I wasn't deterred and said what I needed to. "We're getting a divorce. I'm moving out now. Please contact my lawyer." I left my lawyer's business card on the table, but he didn't even glance at it. He seemed to believe that by ignoring me, I would eventually beg for forgiveness. I left the house for good. Strangely, my husband continued to contact me afterward with messages unrelated to the divorce, such as asking to have a meal together or suggesting we go for a drive while shopping. When I ignored his messages, he sent even more desperate emails, accusing me of being stubborn and insisting he would forgive me if I came back and apologized. At the lawyer's office, he exuded overconfidence, expecting me to be the one in trouble and to break down in tears. With a smirk, he signed the divorce papers, treating the whole situation as if it were a mere formality. I quickly gathered the papers, anxious that he might change his mind and tear them up, and submitted them to the courthouse that same day. Later, my lawyer informed me that my husband hadn't believed I would actually follow through with the divorce. Once he realized I was serious, he started demanding alimony and a division of assets, but communication ceased shortly afterward. I suspect my mother-in-law might have intervened and scolded him to stop. Even after the divorce, I continued receiving bizarre emails from my ex-husband, which I chose to ignore. However, I unexpectedly ran into him one day while dining at a shopping center with friends from school. He was there with his colleagues who were former colleagues of mine, so I knew them all. The encounter was awkward for everyone. They managed to steer him away from our table. My friends, who had only met my ex-husband once at our wedding, found his presence unsettling. "That's my recently separated ex-husband. He's been following me around, and it's causing me distress," I explained to them. When I mentioned this to my friends, they approached his table and, as they walked by, they said, "He's a stalker. That's terrible. So creepy." My ex-husband, who was already uncomfortable around women, quickly retreated from the scene. After that encounter, the delusional emails from him ceased, and I've been enjoying my peaceful life on my own. "I mean, I'd rather live with Mom than with you." It was a quiet Friday night, just as the clock struck midnight. My husband, James, was engrossed in an online game in the living room while I was sitting at the dining table, working on some tasks I'd brought home. When James casually mentioned living separately, as if he were discussing the weather, I was stunned. "Why?" I asked, needing to understand his reasoning, especially since our marriage had been struggling lately. "My name is Madison," I reminded myself. It was midnight on my 35th birthday, and I was in the middle of fertility treatments. James's sudden announcement felt like a bombshell, a cruel, unexpected birthday gift that left me completely speechless. Without taking his eyes off the game, James said, "You're 35 now, right? Even if you do get pregnant, it would be a high-risk pregnancy. I've given up on having kids with you. That's why I'm moving in with my mom." "What? That doesn't make any sense," I shot back, baffled by the disconnect between giving up on children and his decision to live with his mother. James and I had gotten married the year before last. We initially planned to enjoy some time as newlyweds, but James was eager to start a family. As the youngest of 3 brothers, with each of his older brothers already married and having 3 kids each, James was often told by them that it's best to have children while you're young and energetic. Encouraged by this advice, we laughed it off and enthusiastically tried to start our own family, but a year passed without any success. At one point, James snapped, "You need to get this checked out." "Check what?" I asked, confused. "Find out why we're not having kids. There must be something wrong with you," he shouted. I was infuriated by his assumption, but I still went to see a gynecologist, just to be sure. To my dismay, the test revealed that I indeed had issues making conception difficult. The diagnosis was a shock. I had no symptoms and it was completely unexpected. Dr. Thompson explained, "It's challenging, but not impossible for you to conceive naturally." However, sharing this news with James felt overwhelming. That evening, I tried to explain the situation calmly over dinner. James's reaction was triumphant, as if he had been proven right. "I knew it was you," he said with a smug tone. "But I can still get pregnant," I stammered, trying to defend myself. James glared at me with a cold expression. "No, it hasn't happened yet, so it's not going to," he declared, jumping to conclusions. I felt my anger rise. "For all we know, you could be the one with the problem," I retorted, raising my voice. James shouted back, "Madison, the results are clear, yet you still try to blame me. Unbelievable." In a fit of rage, he slammed his hands on the table, causing me to flinch. "You're just a failure who can't have kids," he spat before storming off to the bedroom. James's harsh words left me in tears as I cleaned up the dishes alone. I told myself that he was just shocked and lashed out in the heat of the moment. If we could just have a child, I believed we could be a happy couple again. Determined to win back his heart, I started going to the gynecologist regularly and learning more about our situation. My anxiety grew, and even on the days most likely for conception, we had no success. I became obsessed with the idea of getting pregnant. One morning, I cautiously suggested, "Let's try tonight, please." He responded with disdain, "Isn't it embarrassing to bring up such a topic first thing in the morning?" I blushed, feeling awkward. Though it felt uncomfortable, such discussions should be natural between spouses. Trying to keep my tone gentle, I continued, "You want children too, right?" But James coldly replied, "Honestly, I don't even want kids. They're too expensive. I only considered it because my brothers said a man isn't truly an adult until he has a wife and kids. But now, with this excuse from you, I couldn't care less." From then on, whenever I tried to initiate anything, James would refuse, claiming he was too busy or too tired. I was also exhausted from work, and the repeated rejections were a blow to my pride. Lately, James had become absorbed in online gaming, staying up late into the night. As a result, we hardly talked, let alone had any intimacy. It felt like James had lost interest not only in having children but in me as well. Despite everything, I continued to visit the gynecologist. I was taken aback by the sheer number of couples at the fertility clinic. The place was always bustling, and even with an appointment, a 2 to 3 hour wait was common. It was somewhat comforting to see so many couples facing the same struggles, all doing their best. Occasionally, I'd see couples leaving the doctor's office with tears of joy streaming down their faces. The wives, with still flat bellies, would gently touch their stomachs while their husbands walked closely beside them. I envied them deeply. I wanted a child too, hoping it would restore James's love and bring me happiness. I clung to the fragile hope that having a child would mend things, but I hit a roadblock when I learned that advancing to further treatments would require James to undergo tests. It might now be impossible. The walk back from the clinic always left me feeling desolate and on the verge of tears. As I stepped onto the main street, I noticed an elderly woman in flamboyant attire catching my eye. Her thick makeup and brightly colored dress were almost overwhelming. Though I couldn't recall knowing anyone like her, she had an oddly familiar presence that momentarily distracted me from my tears. Could that be my mother-in-law? I wondered, staring in disbelief. Even though we live in the same city, we rarely cross paths, so she looked completely different from what I remembered. But the distinctive mole on her cheek was unmistakable. My mother-in-law was supposed to be a modestly dressed, typical grandmother, so her radical change in appearance was shocking. I quickly blended into the crowd, trying to avoid her notice. The truth is, my mother-in-law is quite a character. Indulgent with herself yet harshly critical of others, she's notorious for hurling insults that most would find shocking. She showers her youngest son, James, with favoritism, treating her other children merely as financial resources. Even her other sons detest her. When my father-in-law was dying of cancer last year, there was talk of her moving in with one of her sons, but both the eldest and the second son firmly refused. We expected the request might come our way, but she announced she would live alone while she was still healthy, possibly out of spite or simply due to her nature. After my father-in-law's passing, she made a scene, accusing everyone of being ungrateful for stealing an old woman's retirement money and took all his inheritance without sharing it. Despite attempts by my brothers-in-law and James to divide it legally, she refused to budge, and no one could prevail against her. She told me, "I have no interest in getting along with you, so don't come to my house," she said. Despite her usual clashes with my sisters-in-law, this interaction was relatively peaceful. She didn't notice me that day and soon disappeared into a store. Her presence in that shop was so unlike the mother-in-law, I knew that I found myself staring at the store's sign in disbelief. That night, I considered telling James about his mother's unusual behavior but decided against it. She was an adult and with my father-in-law gone, she was on her own. It wasn't my place to comment on her personal choices. After that, I saw her a few more times but chose to ignore it. Months went by, and as my birthday approached, James brought up the idea of moving out. I asked him, "Is there someone else you're interested in?" I wondered if his talk about his mother was just an excuse and if he was planning to remarry. But given that he spent most of his days gaming at home, it didn't seem like he was seeing anyone. I almost laughed at my own cold reasoning. James replied, "Well, there's a girl in my gaming group I kind of like, but it's just online. For all I know, she could be a guy pretending to be a girl." His response only made the situation seem more absurd. If he could make rational judgments about his online interests, why was he suddenly talking about moving out? It made no sense to me. James simply repeated, "I just want to live with my mom more than I want to live with you." I couldn't understand why James would prefer living with his mother instead of staying with me. "So, have you come to dislike me and lost your love for me?" I asked, my heart itching just to voice the question. It felt as though he no longer needed me, a wife who couldn't bear children. I braced myself for his response, trying to hold back my sadness. "Not really." "What?" James's nonchalant reply caught me off guard. Like I said before, I don't care about having kids anymore. What we need is a different financial strategy. "Financial strategy?" I repeated, puzzled by his unexpected words. James nodded with a calm demeanor. "Yeah, it's about my mom's inheritance," he said, his tone serious. I was confused, struggling to see the connection. My brothers are greedy. They'll use any excuse, like having more kids, to claim a larger share of mom's inheritance. I won't let that happen. I was stunned by his blatant admission but kept my thoughts to myself. "But your mother is in great health. Isn't it premature to be discussing inheritance?" "That's exactly the point. She dislikes you but favors me. Living with her now could give me an advantage in the inheritance. Plus, there's a substantial fortune my dad left her. We could live comfortably without working hard. We don't have children to look after us in our old age, so we'll need the money." James explained with a dismissive tone, but I was horrified by the implications. "So, you wanted children because you needed them to care for you in your old age. And now that's not an option. You're aiming for a bigger share of your mother's inheritance." I hoped my assumption was wrong as I sought confirmation from James, but his response confirmed my worst fears. "Exactly. Children are supposed to look after their parents. By living with my mom now, I might even secure the entire inheritance," James said, showing his strong allegiance to his mother and lack of intention to be fair. I remained silent, feeling the depth of his familial ties. James continued, "When mom passes away, I'll move back in with you. You may not be able to have kids, but you're good at housework and bring in a decent salary. You're useful as a housekeeper." "Understood. Let's get a divorce," I blurted out, my frustration overriding James's words. Who would agree to such terms? To live separately and then reunite later was an insult. I knew James, the pampered youngest son, had his flaws, but this selfish scheme was beyond forgiveness. I realized that staying with him would never bring me happiness, and at that moment, my love for James completely vanished. "Let's get a lawyer to divide our assets and finalize the divorce." Divorce? I never mentioned anything about divorcing. Just living separately is fine. Hiring a lawyer seems excessive, James said, suddenly flustered but seeming to reconsider. No, you'll be better off as a single man too. I won't be satisfied unless everything is divided fairly and legally. Plus, having a third party involved will prevent any lingering issues, right? James smirked. Maybe you're right. If I get a large portion of Mom's inheritance, I'll be set for the future and can remarry. Just don't regret this. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. Make sure you have no regrets, I replied. The next day, I contacted a lawyer recommended by a divorced friend and arranged a consultation. I also informed the landlord that only James would be moving out and organized a moving company. While making these arrangements, I overheard James on the phone with his mother saying, "I want to live with you and take care of you." I was astonished that he had proposed moving out before even discussing it with her. According to James, his mother was excited about the arrangement and had a few requests. As a result, the divorce preparations proceeded surprisingly smoothly. Originally, the assets were to be split evenly, but my skilled lawyer negotiated a better deal for me, securing 70% of the assets, including compensation. Given James's selfish reasons for our divorce, I decided not to hold back and claimed what I was entitled to. 3 days after our divorce was finalized, James returned to his family home. I was relaxing in my apartment when my phone rang. It was James and his voice was frantic. "Help me please, let's get married again. There's no inheritance. Mom spent it all on strippers. She's broke and deep in debt, and even the house is mortgaged." "Well, that's unfortunate. Your mom was really into those strip clubs," I said, struggling to suppress a chuckle. Just days earlier, I had seen my former mother-in-law heading into a strip club. Curious, I had checked the price list and was shocked by the figures. She had been frequenting the place for some time, clearly spending a fortune. With James becoming obsessed with online gaming and neglecting visits, she had fallen for a stripper and squandered not only my father-in-law's inheritance but also her own retirement savings, accumulating significant debt in the process. "Why didn't you tell me if you knew?" James demanded. "I don't criticize personal hobbies. I never stopped you from gaming, did I?" I shot back. James hesitated, then tried to shift the topic. "She's asking me to take out loans in my name, but that's not feasible. Could you give me the money from our property division? If we get back together, it's both of our money, right?" "Absolutely not." "Why not? You still care about me, don't you? Your husband is in trouble here. I did love you when we were married, but when you suggested moving out, any affection I have for you vanished completely, especially now when it's clear you're only after money. There's no chance we're getting back together. But my mom's demanding that I give her all my salary. She says it's only natural for children to support their parents. She was always so kind to me alone." James whined pathetically, but his and his mother's entitlement, that they should come first and everyone else should cater to them, was something I had no desire to support. "We're divorced now. We're strangers. Your family's problems are yours to deal with," I replied firmly before hanging up and blocking his number. I called my former sisters-in-law next. Although it had only been 3 days since the divorce, the urgency of the situation made it clear that waiting wasn't an option. I filled them in on the recent developments about my former mother-in-law and the details of the divorce. They expressed their sympathy and promised to deal with James. Soon after, my former brothers-in-law stormed into the family home, creating quite a scene. I heard about the commotion from one of my former sisters-in-law. After James' call, I decided to change the locks on my apartment for safety and made up my mind to move out. It felt like a complete break from the past. While searching for a new place, I discovered that the family home was up for sale. Though I could have inquired about James and his mother, I chose to focus on moving forward. I was ready to leave the past behind and start fresh. I'm now considering a pet-friendly apartment where I can enjoy a leisurely life with a cute cat.